Hello, good evening. It is I, Hitman. Welcome to my channel. This evening I'll be hosting a discussion on the concept and idea of Roman satire. I am joined once again by Columba. How are you, good sir?
Hello, I'm well, feeling very satirical this evening.
Fitting. Yeah, so to sort of start us off, I just want to give a sort of a brief overview. So satire, especially Roman satire, it sort of came about really in the Roman imperial period. So the first real examples are Augustus's reign with people like Horace and Quintilian. Then later on, you've got other figures later on during the Flavians and the five good emperors, especially the early part of the five good emperors. So this evening we'll mostly be looking at Petronius, um, Juvenal, and Martial.
Although, of course, I mean, we mentioned this briefly before we came on. You did also have Varro, who
Oh
supposedly,
yes.
I think the only thing that survives now is De Re Rustica, which is basically how to manage your slaves. But he was meant to have written some satire, and I think he died in 20 BC or there, but 27 BC. So sort of at the start of the Augustus's domination, shall we say?
Mm. Yes, interesting. Uh, because you mentioned Dare Rustica, I'm familiar with that because you see, you said managing your slaves because so I think it doesn't it mean like on country ways.
Yeah, de re rustica is like of country things or of
Mm-hmm.
agricultural things. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Oh, similar vein to Case of the Elders. What is it? De Agricultura.
yeah, yeah. And he was also famously not very kind to his slaves. I mean, when they got too old, they couldn't work. He would just sell them off. It was which was considered pretty bad form. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I would say, it definitely is the case that the Romans were the first to sort of consider satire as its own separate genre, and I think it might have been Quintilian who was quoted as saying it, who was sort of had a famous reputation for eloquence, and he said something along the lines of the Greeks invented all these different forms, but satire at least is ours. But it's interesting. I mean, how much do you give that credence? Because I would say that there are like certain forms that existed previously in the Greek world that you could definitely say are sort of predecessors or parallels.
Well, I'm not that familiar with Greek satire, unfortunately. So, to my perspective, it does seem a very Roman thing because, from all we know, most of the famous sort of ancient satirists are all Roman. So, as you
Mm.
mentioned, Petronius, Martial, Juvenal, Horace, and Quintilian.
Well, you see, I bring it up because you have a couple of different examples that I can think of. I mean, I would say there's no example of anything like it really from the classical Greek period or earlier than that. But once you get into the Hellenistic period after the conquests of Alexander, you do see a couple of figures pop up around the third century. One guy he gets called Menippus. He was Menippus of Gadara. I think Gadara is it would be around Jordan today, northwestern Jordan. And he was a satirist actually. He was a sort of cynic satirist, and his works get the sort of the genre of works that he spawned are called the Menippean satire. They're named after him. So I do think that there were earlier influences, and I think it was one of those things that um, crept in and the Romans sort of adopted. And then also you have Milesian fables or Milesian tales, which I think are named after Aristides of Miletus. Although I might be getting the first name wrong there, but yeah, the Milesian tales, which are essentially body sort of joking tales. You'll have these stock characters of sort of the beaten slave or the untrustworthy wife, and then in Latin you also have the Atellan farces, which would be the sort of the earliest theatrical productions put on by the Romans, and the earliest Latin theatrical productions, which were again sort of very crude for the common people. So I do think that you have perhaps predecessors of certain kinds, but yeah, once you get into the Principate and the Imperial period, that's really the golden age of satire. Because there was so much to satirize, wasn't there?
Oh no, absolutely. And with that, let's get into the first author, which is Petronius. So, with Petronius, so what he's known for is a novel, which is incomplete. Not all fragments of it survive, unfortunately, called the Satyricon. And
Well, you see, novel, we're already getting into controversial territory there. But...
yes, well, it's called that, but because it's incomplete, it's presumed it's a novel. But unless we find more of it, maybe we could confirm. But from what we have, it's sort of presumed to be a novel. But what's even more in dispute is the authorship, because we know it's by someone called Petronius, but there's not much information about him. It's presumed that it was because in the reign of Nero there was a famous sort of lawyer called Petronius Arbiter who was forced to commit suicide by Nero. So it's been presumed it was him, because the novel seems to be from around that time, but we're not certain.
Yeah, I would say it's definitely undeniable that and I wouldn't say novel necessarily, but I would say that it's undeniable that the work dates from around the time of Nero, because there are references in the work to certain gladiators of the time. I think one of them was called Praetus or something like this. And yeah, these were famous fighters in the time of Nero. So I mean, you take that, and then you take the fact that the textual sources refer to this man called Petronius, who was famous for vice, right, and luxury, and then we have this work attributed to a Petronius, which is just full of the most scandalous and debauched things. I think if you put two and two together, it has to be the same guy. But if you like, I have a passage here from Tacitus's Annals. Of course, Tacitus was writing some decades later, but it's Tacitus's Annals 16, section 17 to 20, and it's about who we think, it's about this Petronius who we assume wrote the Satyricon. So if you like, I could read it out briefly.
Certainly, go for it.
Okay. So this is from Tacitus. Gaius Petronius deserves some further attention. He was a man who spent his days sleeping and his nights working or enjoying himself. Industry is the usual foundation of success, but with him it was idleness. Unlike most people who throw away their money in dissipation, he was not regarded as an extravagant sensualist, but as one who made luxury a fine art. His conversation and his way of life were unconventional, with a certain air of nonchalance, and they charmed people all the more by seeming so unstudied. Yet, as proconsul in Bithynia and later as consul, he showed himself a vigorous and capable administrator. His subsequent return to his old habits, whether this was real or apparent, led to his admission to the small circle of Nero's intimates, where he became the arbiter of elegance. In the end, Nero's jaded appetite regarded nothing as enjoyable or refined unless Petronius had given his sanction to it. Consequently, the jealousy of Tigellinus was aroused against him. He saw in Petronius a rival, someone superior to himself in the whole art of pleasure. So he worked upon the emperor's cruelty, his master passion, to which all his other lusts were subordinate. Accusing Petronius of being an intimate of Scaevinus, he bribed a slave to give evidence against him. Petronius did not have a chance to reply, and Tigellinus threw most of his household into prison. The emperor at this time happened to be on a visit to Campania. Petronius got as far as Cumae and was prevented from going any farther. He refused to prolong the suspense that hope or fear involved. Not that he was hasty in taking leave of life. On the contrary, he opened his veins, and then, as the fancy took him, he bound them up or reopened them. Meanwhile, he talked with his friends, but not on serious topics or anything calculated to win admiration for his stoicism. He listened to their contributions, not discussions about the immortality of the soul or the views of philosophers, but simply gay songs and light verse. He dealt out rewards to some of his slaves and floggings to others. He had a good dinner. He had a good dinner served and slept for a while, so that his death, although forced on him, should appear natural. Even in the codicils to his will, he refused to put down any of the usual deathbed flatteries for Nero or Tigellinus or any of the other courtiers. Instead, he wrote out a full description of the emperor's vicious activities, prefaced with the names of his male and female partners, and specifying the novel forms his lust had taken. This document he sent under seal to Nero. Then he broke his signet ring in case it should be used later to endanger others. Nero's puzzlement as to how his nocturnal ingenuities were known was resolved by blaming one Celia. This was a not insignificant person, a senator's wife, in fact, who had been a chosen partner in all the emperor's vices, and also a close friend of Petronius. She was later exiled for her lack of discretion about what she had seen and experienced. And so that's the quote from Tacitus, which is we assume about Petronius, this Petronius arbiter. I mean, arbiter, of course, in all likelihood, wasn't his actual cognomen. It was just this this sort of fanciful title that had been granted to him. And I think there are a couple of interesting things in there. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is who's another famous writer who slit his wrists and worked for Nero. Of course, you think of Seneca, yeah. And I think it's interesting that in that quote from Tacitus, he says that Petronius did this not to make a not to make a show of any stoic virtue. He actually references the Stoics. So I think it's really interesting to compare the way that these two figures went out, so to speak. So yeah, I think it's a fascinating passage and very ballsy. And of course, again, when you consider this idea of him being the arbiter of elegance, that is a theme that you see running throughout what is left of the Satyricon, right? A lot of it seems to be about taste and class and sort of elegance.
And just that phrase by Tacitus, nocturnal ingenuities.
yeah.
That's one way to put it, wherever Nero was up to. Okay, well, what I'd now like to do is so with the Satyricon, so what's also important is the name is a play on words, because satire obviously is to mock or to ridicule, but also the way it's spelled as it's translated into English is like satyr, which is a sort of human goat creature like Mr. Tumnus from Narnia.
Only perhaps a little more lascivious than Mr. Tumnus.
Sorry, just the first example that came into my head. So, but because satyrs are known for being very jovial and sort of comical. So that's sort of what he was going with the title, and it's about the adventures of these two this sort of homosexual couple. It's Encolpius and Giton, and
I wouldn't even call them homosexual. They sort of just take a go at anything that moves.
Any sexual, but because you talked about the lewdness, because Encolpius, from what I was reading, is like Greek for crotch as well.
yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Yes, and it's all these weird and wonderful adventures they get up to. But the passage I'm going to read is from one of the surviving segments and one of the more well-known segments, which is they're invited to this dinner party by this freedman called Trimalchio, who's quite very sort of very over the top, shall we say? So
yeah, you could put it that way. Yeah.
Right. Well, I'll read it through. Interrupt me at any point for commentary.
Sure. I mean, just before you begin, briefly, I'd just like to mention some points about sort of the state of the text and sort of intentions around it, because I think it is something that's really interesting. I mean, you called it a novel, and this is something that's sort of hotly debated. Because the work is called the Satyricon, or at least that's the title we have, and there's this idea of it being explicitly a satire. And if it's a satire, then you don't take anything in it seriously. But there is always been a strain in scholarship and people who have read it of viewing it, like you say, as the first novel that tries to tell about life and all of its sort of gritty seriousness and things like this. And I certainly think that there is an element of that. It is a lot more grounded than a lot of the other sort of farces that you can read. Nothing explicitly sort of like supernatural themes aren't particularly important. It's not like, say, Apuleius's Golden Ass, where he drinks this potion and turns into a donkey or anything like that. It's just it's this very sort of lurid story of sort of dinner parties and orgies and things like this. So I do think that there is an element of that. But I think there's a debate as well around whether or not the work was much longer than what would have been a novel. I mean, some schools of thought say that it would have been up to 20 books long, judging
Mm.
off of the sort of the context of the fragments that are left. And it's interesting because one theme that comes up again and again in the fragments is that Encolpius, I would say the main character, the narrator, he's offended the god Priapus. If anyone's familiar with their Roman mythology, Priapus is a, shall we say, a very well endowed deity. And and yeah, and Encolpius has displeased this god. We don't know exactly what, something to do with his temple or his festival, and so the god is sort of pursuing him and hampering him at every step. And if you know anything about classical literature, the first thing that will jump to mind is the Aeneid or the Odyssey. I mean, Odysseus, it takes him so long to get home because Poseidon is really angry with him because he's killed Poseidon's son. He's offended the god. And so I think that's the reason why some schools also think that the work might have been a long parody of the older epics, where instead of having this hero who's engaged in these great wars and Neptune's angry with him. Instead, it's Priapus is angry with him, and so he sort of lurches around, getting into one horrendous situation after another. So yeah, there's some very interesting schools of thought around the intention of the work.
Thank you very much, Columba. That was wonderful. So without further ado, let's give this a read. So, okay. So dinner with Trimalchio. The next day, but one finally arrived, but we were so knocked about that we wanted to run rather than rest. We were mournfully discussing how to avoid the approaching storm, when one of Agamemnon's slaves broke in on our frantic debate. "Here," said he, "don't you know who's your host today? It's Trimalchio. He's terribly elegant. He has a clock in the dining room and a trumpeter all dressed up to tell him how much longer he's got to live." This made us forget all our troubles. We dressed carefully and told Giton, who was very kindly acting as our servant, to attend us at the baths. We did not take our clothes off, but we began wandering around, or rather, exchanging jokes, or circulating among the little groups. Suddenly, we saw a bald old man in a reddish shirt, playing ball with some long-haired boys. It was not so much the boys that made us watch, although they alone were worth the trouble, but the old gentleman himself. He was talking his exercise in slippers and throwing a green ball around, but he didn't pick it up if it touched the ground. Instead, there was a slave holding a bag full. He supplied them to the players. We noticed other novelties. 2 eunuchs stood around at different points. One of them carried a silver chamber pot. The other counted the balls, not those flying from hand to hand according to the rules, but those that fell to the ground. We were still admiring those elegant arrangements when Menelaus hurried up to us. "This is the man you'll be dining with," he said. "In fact, you are now watching the beginning of the dinner." No sooner had Menelaus spoken than Trimalchio snapped his fingers. At the signal, the eunuch brought up the chamber pot for him, while he went on playing with the weight of his bladder. He demanded water for his... Sorry?
No, it's such a funny image. He just has all these slaves crowding around him, and again, like it does sound utterly absurd, but there is always this question of how realistic is this? Because I mean, we know from inscriptions or various forms of archaeological evidence and histories that some very wealthy Romans in this period had an obscene number of slaves, hundreds of slaves, and to the point where they were at a loss on what to do with these slaves. I mean, we have funeral records of slaves who have jobs like clothes folders and mirror. He was a mirror holder or so. I mean, it's absurd. And so this idea of having one slave holding your chamber pot, having one holding the balls, it sounds just utterly ridiculous, but when you start to consider just how luxurious these rich Romans' lives were in reality, then it really does make you think.
Certainly, it's you're really, really, passing that division of labour, aren't you, when you're having them just do these?
Yeah, mirror holder. I think my
Yeah.
favorite. There was one woman. No, it was a man, and he was a wig balancer. So his job was literally to follow his mistress around with a stick, and if her hair began to topple, he would poke it and sort of rearrange it and keep it standing, which is just it's the most
Farcical.
ridiculous thing. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, what I find also interesting is that you mentioned this whole idea that the work could possibly be a satire or mocking those old Homeric epics. It's interesting that two of the slaves, one's called Agamemnon and another's called Menelaos. It's
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, and that was also a very common thing that happened in reality. You know, rich Romans would get their slaves, and they would give them these very fanciful names. You know, you would have your, and sometimes they would do it in quite a funny way. You know, where you would have like a cupbearer or some quite dainty profession, and they would call them Hercules or Ajax or something like that. So yeah.
sort of, it's all sort of whimsical. And well, let's continue. So, right, where was I? Okay. With the weight off his bladder, he demanded water for his hands, splashed a few drops on his fingers, and wiped them on the boy's head. It would take too long to pick out isolated incidents. Anyway, we entered the baths where we began sweating at once and we went immediately into the cold water. Trimalchio had been smothered in perfume and was already being rubbed down, not with linen towels, but with bathrobes of the finest wool. And this was going on. Three messieurs sat drinking Falernian in front of him. Through quarrelling, they spilled most of it, and Trimalchio said they were drinking his health. Wrapped in thick scarlet felt he was put into a litter. Four couriers with lots of medals went in front, as well as a go-kart in which his favourite boy was riding, a wizened, bleary-eyed youngster, uglier than his master. As he was carried off, a musician with a tiny set of pipes took his place by Trimalchio's head, and whispered a tune in his ear the whole way. We followed on, choking with
Yeah, you see
amazement.
that's an interesting point there about this bleary-eyed, ugly boy. Because I mean, you know, as dark as it sounds, this was something that was quite common. You know, a Roman man would have his favorite boy, and you know, you don't want to know what they got up to, but usually it would be a very attractive young man. And the idea that Trimalchio just has this ugly, squat little boy, you know, that to me is certainly like very comic and satirical. So again, it's sort of trying to tease out what's real and what's not. But I would recommend people go and read it. It will raise a chuckle from you occasionally, but it is I mean, it still has the power to shock today, I would say.
And it's also the fact he's got him like wheeling this like little go kart around with Trimalchio being carried by some couriers as well.
So good. I wonder what the Latin is for go kart. I need to get a hold of a Latin copy, you know, because I've seen it rendered as go kart a couple of times. But, you know, anyway.
Okay, so right, we followed on, choking with amazement by now, and arrived at the door with Agamemnon at our side. On the doorpost, a notice was fastened which read, "Any slave leaving the house without his master's permission will receive 100 lashes." Just at the entrance stood the hall porter, dressed in a green uniform with a belt of cherry red. He was shelling peas into a silver basin. Over the doorway hung, of all things, a golden cage from which a spotted magpie greeted visitors. As I was gaping at all this, I almost fell over backwards and broke a leg. There on the left, as one entered, not far from the porter's cubbyhole, was a huge dog with a chain round its neck. It was painted on the wall, and over it, in big capitals, was written, "Beware of the dog." My colleagues laughed at me, but when I got my breath back, I went on to examine the whole wall. There was a mural of a slave market, price tags and all. Then Trimalchio himself, holding a wand of Mercury and being led into Rome by Minerva. After this, a picture of how he learned accounting and finally how he became a steward. The painstaking artist had drawn it all in great detail with descriptions underneath. Just when the colonnade ended, Mercury hauled him up by the chin and rushed him to a high platform. Fortune with her flowing cornucopia and the three fates spinning their golden threads were there in attendance.
And
I also noted
of course, Mercury is the god of tradesmen, merchants, and travelers. So an appropriate patron for a budding sort of accountant and businessman.
yes, just what I was thinking as well. I'm reading that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I
But
mean,
it's
there's another.
interesting.
Oh, sorry. After you.
Yes, because we obviously mentioned Trimalchio is a freedman, so you know he's owned slaves. But it's interesting, he's not like an old style aristocrat that's of noble birth. He's this sort of man of money and wealth,
He's
and that's
he's,
why
he's nouveau riche. He's nouveau
yes.
riche. Yeah, and this was an extremely common thing. I mean, you know, it's something that I've harped on about quite a lot, but I think people need to wrap their heads around it if they really want to understand um, Roman history, and that's also why sources like this can be so valuable from an historical perspective, because you won't get a terrible amount of it in the actual Roman historians themselves. But yeah, in the wake of the Punic Wars, you had hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of slaves imported to Rome from Africa, from Asia. Many of them working on latifundia, the large slave farms, but many of them in the city as well. And within a couple of generations, they would be freed. And it even got to the point where as early as the late Republic, decades before this is written. Of course, the Romans voted in tribes. When they had their elections, there were actually several tribes that were added to the rolls by the censors, who were the officials in charge, just for freedmen. Which gives you an idea that they were actually becoming this political force, this class within the city. And I think that's something that you need to understand. And a lot of older scholars, I mean, of course, today you can understand how these ideas of tyranny and immigration from the East, yeah, they're not very fashionable now. But if you read someone like Geltzer, who was I think a German, who wrote a famous biography of Julius Caesar, he claims exactly that, and he says that this mass import of Easterners, who had a very despotic conception of politics. These were people who budding despots like Caesar could actually rely on. So, there's a bunch of interesting points there. But I mean, yeah, one thing that you have coming through in all of the satires and the more light stuff is, yeah, like how crude these people are. I mean, it's the same today. If you go to some crap neighborhood, and you find a chav, or some guy in a tracksuit standing there, and you hand him £1 billion, he's not suddenly going to develop class, even if he tried. And so I think he's always going to be crude and vulgar in some sense, and also, of course, these freedmen, especially the ones that got wealthy, were absolutely despised by the old nobility.
Yes, and another thought that comes to my mind is because where I said they're not like the old aristocracy, there's no noblesse oblige towards their own slaves, because you would think with someone like Trimalchio being a slave, you'd think he might treat them better, but no, he's very tyrannical. And because for example, if you read the letters of Pliny the Younger, he was someone who was of much more noble pedigree. If you read what he says about his own slaves, he's got that noblesse oblige, I would say, towards them, unlike Trimalchio.
Yeah, I definitely think there's part of that. I mean, again, I don't know how much you can take the figure of Trimalchio seriously, but certainly he's representative, at least to some extent. And I do think that, psychologically speaking, there is something there of if you have someone who's, as you say, has been raised with that noblesse oblige, they can entertain those notions. But if you have someone who has struggled and managed to get to the top despite everything, they're going to have no sympathy for people who are in the situation that they were once in, and they're going to sort of enjoy their newfound sort of power and status. So yeah, I definitely think you're onto something there.
Oh, and another point. Um, Remember, it's he's holding the Order Mercury and being led into Rome by Minerva. Minerva being the Roman equivalent of Athena, the goddess of wisdom and learning. So it's sort of implying that he's rather intelligent or well learned as well.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. I also noticed in the colonnade a company of runners practicing with their trainer. In one corner was a large cabinet that served as a shrine for some silver statues of the household deities, with a marble figure of Venus and an impressive gold casket in which, they told me, the master's first beard was preserved. I began asking the porter what were the pictures they had in the middle: the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the gladiatorial show given by Laenas, he told me. Time did not allow us to look at many of the pictures. By now we had reached the dining room, at the entrance to which sat a treasurer going over the accounts. There was
Oh,
one.
one last point that I would like to briefly mention before we get off of that. Again, we had this idea that this is a parody of epic works. And I remember discussing with a professor of mine years ago now, this interesting idea that essentially this section where Encolpius is coming in and looking at this this big relief that is displaying the story of Trimalchio's life. This could be seen as, in some ways, a parody of Virgil's work, because I don't know if you remember in the Aeneid, there is this scene where Aeneas is in Carthage with Dido, the queen of Carthage, and she shows him a relief, or I believe it might be a sculptured relief on some bronze doors for the new temple, and it's showing the sort of the history of the foundation of the city. And so and you know, she's showing this to Aeneas, and he's considering all these carvings, and it's this very grand epic scene. So I think you know, some scholars have come up with the idea that this could be in some way a sort of a parody or a joke related to scenes like that. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that in as well. Sorry.
And the fact is, you've got this mention of the gold casket and the statue of Venus that's made of marble, and you've been told that there's something. So you think, oh, there's something valuable, and it's just no. His first beard is preserved there, not any grand or historic treasure or heirloom of his family.
Well, I mean, the first beard was something that was quite valued. I mean, even you know, it's interesting that it's Petronius, because the most famous example of that story comes from, I believe it's in Suetonius's Life of Nero, where Nero has his first beard, his first shavings, kept in a, you know, similarly elaborate box. Of course, the joke in Suetonius is that when Nero did it, it was, you know, he could barely grow a beard, and it was just like, you know, this beautiful gold box with like 4 hairs inside, you know. But yeah, so you know, it's interesting that you see the same thing in Petronius, who was, you know, in all likelihood one of Nero's pals.
Yes. So, okay. Yeah. So time did not allow us to look at many of the pictures. By now, we had reached the dining room. At the entrance to it sat a treasurer going over the accounts. There was one feature I particularly admired. On the doorposts were fixed rods and axes, tapering off at the lowest point into something like the bronze beak of a ship. On it was the inscription, presented to C. Pompeius Trimalchio, priest of the Augustan College, by his steward Cinemus. Beneath the same inscription, a fixture with twin lamps dangled from the ceiling, and 2 notices, one on each doorpost. One of them, if my memory is correct, had written on it, 30 and the 31st of December, Argius is out to dinner. The other displayed representatives of the moon's phases and the 7 heavenly bodies. Lucky and unlucky days were marked with different coloured studs. Having had enough of these interesting things, we attempted to go in, but one of the slaves shouted, "Right foot first." Naturally, we hesitated, a moment in case one of us should cross the threshold the wrong way. But just as we were all stepping forward, a slave with his back bare flung himself at our feet and began pleading with us to get him off a flogging. He was in trouble for nothing very serious. Oh, sorry?
No, I was just going to say briefly. I mean, the point about right foot first is again something that I think you can attribute to these points of these themes of class and taste, which run through the work, because you know, a lot of upper class Romans, and I mean Romans, like bred Romans, you know, had come to regard things like that as just silly superstitions. And there was this idea that superstitions are for the vulgar. And of course, the idea here is that the left is considered unlucky, right, or evil. I mean, you know, the word is sinistra, right? That's where we get the word sinister from. You know, so you have to cross over the threshold with your right foot. And again, I think it's just that point of the vulgarity and the superstition of this this nouveau riche, who have means but are still, at the end of the day, yeah, just scum.
Yes, and the fact that you've got this slave as well, that plaguing to be let off a flogging, again, it's conjuring in your mind that Trimalchio's not exactly a merciful master, is he? So,
Well, I mean, I'm pretty sure he does let him off, doesn't he? So...
yeah, good point. We're about to read that. So, he lifted his head haughtily. It is not so much the actual loss that annoys me. Hang on. Oh, sorry, I read ahead. One moment. Yes, sir. He was in trouble for nothing very serious. He told us the steward's clothes, hardly worth 10 sesterces, had been stolen from him at the baths. Back went our feet, and we appealed to the steward, who was counting out gold pieces in the office, to let the man off. He lifted his head haughtily. It is not so much the actual loss that annoys me, he said. It's the wretch's carelessness. They were my dinner clothes he lost. A client had presented them to me on my birthday. Genuine Tyrian purple, of course. However, they had been laundered once. So what does it matter? He's all yours. Yes, he does let them off, though I would say I think this is the steward and not Trimalchio himself, so...
Yeah, and there's also that very crude materialism coming in where he says, he says something that perhaps you could respect. That's the interesting thing. He says, oh well, it's not so much the thing itself, it's the carelessness that I don't like. And you can sort of get behind that, but then he turns around and he says, well, it's already been laundered, the color's faded, so who cares? And so he comes back to the materialism of it. And of course that's a theme that runs through the work as well.
And also the fact it's in the Tyrian purple, that's obviously very, very expensive. So
yeah.
Okay. We were very much obliged to him for this favour, and when we did enter the dining room, that same slave whose cause we had pleaded ran up to us, and to our utter confusion, covered us with kisses. Oh, sorry.
No.
Okay, sorry. And thanked us for our kindness. And what's more, he said, you'll know right away who it is you have been so kind to. The master's wine is the waiter's gift. Finally, we took our places. Boys from Alexandria poured ice water over our hands. Others followed them and attended to our feet, removing any hangnails with great skill. But they were not quite even during this troublesome operation. They sang away at their work. I wanted to find out if the whole staff were singers, so I asked for a drink. In a flash, a boy was there, singing in a shrill voice while he attended to me. Anyone else who was asked to bring something did the same. It was more like a musical comedy than a respectable dinner party. Some extremely... Yep.
I mean, again, it's this idea of Trimalchio overcompensates in absolutely everything, and this was a classic thing, going all the way back to the Greeks with their symposia hundreds of years before that. Everyone would bring a sort of a party trick, and that you would have servants that would come in and play music and things like this. But with Trimalchio, it's taken to just this absurd extreme where all of the servants, all the serving boys, are just constantly singing all the time, even if they're terrible. It's just this bizarre comedy. It's very funny.
Yes. Some extremely elegant hors d'oeuvres were served at this point. By now, everyone had taken his place with the exception of Trimalchio, for whom, strangely enough, the place at the top were reserved. The dishes for the first course included an ass of Corinthian bronze with 2 panniers, white olives on one side and black on the other. Over the ass were 2 pieces of plate, with Trimalchio's name and the weight of the silver inscribed on the rims. There was some small...
you see, there we go. That's exactly the materialism. He has the weight of the silver on the side of the dish, so people can see how much it weighs, which I think is so funny.
Yeah, but if you think about it, it's silver, not gold. So but maybe I'm being petty, but I'm just thinking, he's trying to show that he's wealthy. But if he was really wealthy, it'd be gold, wouldn't it? Well, yeah. If he's going to show off Columba, I'm going to hold him to the highest standards. So.
Yeah, like a true Roman.
Right. Okay. Yeah, there were some small iron frames shaped like bridges supporting dormice sprinkled with honey and poppy seed. There were steaming hot sausages too, on a silver gridiron with damsons and pomegranate seeds underneath. We were in the middle of these elegant dishes when Trimalchio himself was carried in to the sound of music and set down on a pile of tightly stuffed cushions. The sight of him drew an astonished laugh from the guests. He cropped his head, stuck out from a scarlet coat. His neck was well muffled up, and he had put round in a napkin with a broad purple stripe and tassels dangling there and here and there. On the little finger on his left hand he wore a heavy gilt ring, and a smaller one on the last joint of his next finger. This I thought was solid gold, but actually it was studded with little iron stars. And show off even more of his jewellery, he had his right arm...
I would say, with regard to the napkin or neckerchief that he's wearing, it's described as having a broad purple stripe. And that itself is a sort of a bit of a joke, because of course you had the laticlavius, which is the broad stripe. It was a term used in the military as well for the military tribune, the highest military tribune, and it was essentially denoting a man of senatorial rank. So it's this idea that he has the stripe of a senatorial, but he's using it as a sort of like a tablecloth or an apron, essentially.
Yes. Also, and I like. I thought the ring was solid gold, but it was actually studded with little iron stars. So again, it's appearing fancy, but it's doesn't quite have the same value or luster on closer inspection. Right. Okay, and show off even more of his jewellery. He had his right arm bare and set off by a gold armlet and an ivory circlet fastened with a gleaming metal plate. After picking his teeth with a silver toothpick, he began, "My friends, I wasn't keen to come into the dining room yet, but if I stayed away any more, I would have kept you back, so I've deprived myself of all my little pleasures for you. However, you'll allow me to finish my game." A boy was at his heels with a board of terebinth wood with glass squares, and I noticed the very last word in luxury. Instead of white and black pieces, he had gold and silver coins. While he was swearing away like a trooper over his game, and we were still on the hors d'oeuvres, a tray was brought in with a basket on it. There sat a wooden hen, its wings spread around it in the way hens are when they are broody. Two slaves hurried up, and as the orchestra played a tune, they began searching through the straw, and dug out peahens' eggs, which were they then distributed to the guests. Trimalchio turned to look at this little scene and said, "My friends, I gave orders for that bird to sit on some peahens' eggs. I hope to goodness they are not starting to hatch. However, let's try them and see if they are still soft." We took up our spoons, weighing at least half a pound each, and cracked the eggs, which were made of rich pastry. To tell the truth, I nearly threw away my share, as the chicken seemed already formed. But I heard a guest who was an old hand say, "There should be something good here." So I searched the shell with my fingers and found the plumpest little fig pecker, all covered with yolk and seasoned with pepper. At this point, Malchio became tired of his game and demanded that all the previous dishes be brought to him. He gave permission in a loud voice for any of us to have another glass of mead if we wanted it. Suddenly, there was a crash.
Again, there's another just a little subtle joke there that people might not pick up on. This idea that he comes in late to the dinner, and then and then instead of the polite thing to do would be to just pick up where everyone else is and have the same dish that everyone else is having. But no, Trimalchio's like, "Bring me all of the dishes that I've missed. I'm going to catch up."
Yes. Yeah. So he gave permission in a loud voice for any of us to have another glass of mead if we wanted it. Suddenly, there was a crash from the orchestra, and the troop of waiters, all still singing, snatched away the hors d'oeuvres. However, in the confusion, one of the side dishes happened to fall, and a slave picked it up from the floor. Trimalchio noticed this and had the boy's ears boxed and told him to throw it down again. A cleaner came in with a broom and began to sweep up the silver plates along with the rest of the rubbish.
It's just sweeping up silver dishes, that goes in the bin. Doesn't care. But the slave can't have it. That's the interesting thing, he'll throw it away, but he won't give it to one of the slaves.
No. And two long-haired Ethiopians followed him, carrying small skin bottles like those they use for scattering sand in the circus, and they poured wine over our hands. No one ever offered us water. Our host was complimented on these elegant arrangements. "You've got to fight fair," he replied. "That's why I gave orders for each guest to have his own table." At the same time, these smelly slaves won't crowd so. Carefully sealed wine bottles were immediately brought. They're next labelled Falernian, Consul Opimius, 100 years old. While we were examining the labels, Trimalchio clapped his hands and said with a sigh, "Wine has a longer life than us poor folks, so let's wet our whistles. Wine is life. I'm giving you real Opimian. I didn't put out such good stuff yesterday, though the company was much better class. Naturally, we drank and missed no opportunity of admiring his elegant hospitality. In the middle of this, a slave brought in a silver skeleton, put together in such a way that its joints and backbone could be pulled out and twisted in all directions. After he had been flung it about on the table once or twice, its flexible joints falling into various postures, Trimalchio recited, "Man's life, alas, is but a span, so let us live it while we can. We'll be like this when we're dead." After our applause, the next course was brought in.
Actually, this is something that you get as well. I because Trimalchio, he thinks of himself as being this cultured Roman, and so he you have these absurd entertainments where there's this jangling silver skeleton getting thrown around the room, and then he decides, he has these little 3 lines on mortality, which is really bad poetry, and I've been assured that the Latin is equally bad. And so again, it's just the whole thing is just poking fun of this freedman who thinks that he is the bee's knees, but really he knows next to nothing about real culture.
No, it's all a bit of a circus, isn't it?
Yeah.
And yes, there's one little paragraph I want to read, and then I think we'll move on. So after our applause, the next course was brought in. Actually, it was not as grand as we expected, but it was so novel that everyone stared. It was a deep circular tray with the 12 signs of the zodiac arranged around the edge. Over each of them, the chef had placed some appropriate dainty suggested by the subject. Over Aries the ram, butter beans. Over Taurus the bull, a beefsteak. Over the heavenly twins, testicles and kidneys. Over Cancer the crab, a garland. Over Leo the lion, an African fig. Over Virgo the virgin, a young sow's udder. Over Libra the scales, a balance of a tart in one pan and a cake in the other. Over Scorpio, a lobster. Over Sagittarius the archer, a bullseye. Over Capricorn, a horned fish. Over Aquarius the water carrier, a goose. Over Pisces the fishes, 2 mullets. In the centre was a piece of grassy turf bearing a honeycomb. A young Egyptian slave carried bread around in a silver oven, and in a sickening voice he mangled a song from the show The Asafoetida Man. And that's the end of that paragraph.
You see, I think it would have been good if you included what follows immediately on from that, because Trimalchio, the host, this big fat freedman.
I mean, if it's the next paragraph, I don't mind adding it. I'm just conscious of the time, so.
No, I think throw that in, because I think that
Okay.
that's another interesting point.
Okay, sure. And one other thing I'll say, I like all the symbolism on the zodiac, and also about the slaves. Not only has he got lots of slaves, they're exotic, because remember, you've got the 2 long-haired Ethiopians, and now we've got the Egyptian slave as well. So.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was it was an exotic thing, you know. I mean, the further away your slaves were from, it was sort of a status symbol. I mean, there's even a fresco. I think it's in Pompeii, or it could be Herculaneum, but I think it's Pompeii, and it shows a Roman dinner party, and one of the men sitting there, you know, of course they're lying down on their couches, and he has this boy next to him who's a little Ethiopian boy, a little black boy, but he's dressed in this silk purple outfit, which is, you know, I mean, the average citizen couldn't hope to afford something like this, and so he's got them all dressed up, and yeah, it was sort of a status symbol. I mean, you see the same thing in the 16 and 1700s in Europe. If you think of, you know, I think a couple of Gainsborough portraits of, you know, English country families, and they'll have their Negro slave, you know, helping one of the children off their horse or something. So, yeah, for sure.
Right. Okay, so as we started rather reluctantly on this inferior fare, Trimalchio said, "Let's eat if you don't mind. This is the source of all order." As he spoke, 4 dancers hurtled forward in time to the music and removed the upper part of the great dish, revealing underneath plump fowls, sow's udders, and a hare with wings, fixed to his middle to look like Pegasus. We also noticed 4 little figures of Marsyas, which let a peppery fish sauce go running over some fish, which seemed to be swimming in a little channel. We all joined in the servants' applause, and amid some laughter, we helped ourselves to these quite exquisite things. Trimalchio was every bit as delighted as we were with this piece of ingenuity. "Carver," he cried. Up came the man with the carving knife, and with his hands moving in time to the orchestra, he sliced up the victuals like a charioteer battling to the sound of organ music. And still, Trimalchio went on saying insistently, "Carver, Carver." I suspected this repetition was connected with some joke, and I went so far as to ask the man on my left what he meant. He had watched this sort of game quite often and said, "You see the fellow doing the carving? His name's Carver, so whenever he says Carver, he's calling out his name and his orders."
Because the thing, I mean, it's just such a terrible joke, you know. And it's, again, it's this idea that Trimalchio thinks he's being really clever, you know. He's like, "Oh, I'm telling him to carve, and his name's Carver," you know. And of course, everyone's laughing because they're all just sycophants, you know. Yeah, I do think you have to admire Petronius's literary skill, because I think a lot of Roman literature, you know, character development isn't really much of a thing at all. But I think Petronius has done such a good job here, and Trimalchio is this this really evocative character, isn't he?
Yes, and you know, again, I'm just thinking with his slaves, your slave, your name, you're just what you do, which is carve. You don't even have a proper personal name.
Yeah, yeah. So I actually made a bit of a mistake there. I thought that the section I was looking for came immediately after that, but I have it here because I have my copy, and it's just relating to the signs of the zodiac and the dishes. So I could maybe read it out, and then we could talk about it if you like. It's just a paragraph.
I think we've already read that. Was there another paragraph where they come back to that?
No. This is after the zodiac dishes, it's Trimalchio giving an interpretation on them.
Okay, go for it.
So yeah, here we go. We applauded the wit of our astrologer, and he went on. Then the whole heavens turns into the little old bull. So bull-headed folk are born then, and cowherds, and those who find their own feed. Under the heavenly twins, on the other hand, pairs in hand, yokes of oxen, people with big bollocks, and people who have it both ways. I was
Oh
born under
my.
yeah, I was born under the crab, so I have a lot of legs to stand on and a lot of property on land and sea, because the crab takes both in his stride. And that's why I put nothing over him earlier, so as not to upset my horoscope. Under Leo were born greedy and domineering people. Under the Virgin, effeminates, runaways, and candidates for the chain gang. Under the Scales, butchers, perfume sellers, and anyone who weighs things up. Under Scorpio, poisoners and murderers. Under Sagittarius are born squint-eyed people who look at the vegetables and then take the bacon. Under Capricorn, people in trouble who sprout horns through their worries. Under the Water Carrier, bartenders and jugheads. Under the Fishes, fish fryers and people who spout in public. And so, it's this really funny sort of taking a swipe at all these different occupations, but
Yes.
just to bring it back to that point about vulgarity again, and we've already mentioned this idea that, oh no, you have to step over the threshold with your right foot first. Of course, astrology was another one of these things that was viewed by many respectable citizens as a superstition, as a silly thing. But you can see that Trimalchio, I mean, in the same way that today, right? I mean, you have your women who read their Hello magazine, or your men who read their Daily Mail, and you'll get a horoscope section, and it's this very working class thing that people of higher classes sort of sneer on. But he's very superstitious. He doesn't put a dish over the crab because he doesn't want to upset his horoscope. So again, it's just that building up that characterization of the freedman, the vulgar freedman.
Yes, thank you. That was yes. I forgot about that little bit, but it's absolutely wonderful. His explanation.
Yeah,
So
it's great.
yeah. So
I love it for Gemini. Was it people with big bollocks and people who like it both ways?
yes.
It's so funny, man.
Right. So yeah. So next we come to Juvenal and the satires. So with Juvenal, he's interesting because with a lot of satire, especially with people like Marshall, they tend to be of sort of a freeman rank, whereas in Juvenal, it's believed he was actually of the elite, because for a lot of the satires, you get this very condescending tone, don't you?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know if Marshall was a freedman. I think his origins are kind of a little strange. I mean, I think he was from Spain, wasn't he? So I think he could perhaps have been born a citizen, but he mentions in his own work that he has some sort of I think Celtic blood or Celtiberian blood. But I'm not sure if he was a freedman. But yeah, Juvenal was certainly a man of some standing.
Yeah, what more trying to say was that Juvenal was of a much higher social rank than, say, someone like Marshall. That's the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and with Juvenal, what he does with all his satire is he adopts the idea of the persona, which I think you get a lot in satire going forward. Is you don't speak as yourself; you kind of create this character in which you speak through, and he does that for each of them, because there's 16 satires in total, and the satire which I'm going to be reading from is satire number 3, and in this one, Juvenal sort of takes on the persona of Ambricius, this Roman freedman who's sort of middle aged, and he's a lot of the themes in the satire actually very much resonate with our modern society. Funnily enough, the sort of criticism of like everything going wrong or going to shit, and foreigners
Yeah.
coming and taking all the jobs, and a lot of like urban decay.
And this is definitely why I think, people who are interested in Roman history, especially the sort of the decline and fall of Rome, you have to read satirical works and epigrammatists, guys like Martial and Juvenal, because it will give you, a much sort of, shall we say, earthier insight into exactly what was going on in the city, and there's information there that perhaps a respectable historian wouldn't want to include in his work for a variety of reasons. So yeah, definitely I would encourage people to check them out.
And with that, let's get the reading. So, Satire 3. Despite the wrench of parting, I applaud my old friend's decision to make his home in lonely Cumae and give the Sibyl at least one fellow citizen. A charming coastal retreat, this, and the gateway to Baiae. Though myself, I prefer a barren island to downtown Rome. What squalor, what isolation.
Baiae was like a famous resort. Basically, a lot of authors mention it as being a place where the richest of the rich would have their villas. So I guess he's not quite in the Beverly Hills, but he's not far off.
No, certainly not. And yeah, so what squalor, what isolation would not be minor evils compared to an endless nightmare of fires and collapsing houses, the myriad perils encountered in this brutal city, and poets reciting their epics all through August. Yes, there he's referencing the fact that the Romans, especially around the time of the late Republic, early Empire, I think had about 1 million people, and they were constant fires because they had a fire service which was used daily because it just kept happening, and you had those what were those apartment blocks called? The name's slipping my mind.
Insulae, yeah.
Insulae, that's it. Yeah.
No, I mean, we didn't get to it because of time constraints, but the actual the section of Trimalchio's dinner that we have actually ends with there's some panic. I can't remember exactly what happens, and one of the slaves is just screaming, and the other one's blowing their horn. And so the vigiles or the vigiles, who are the sort of firemen, the night watch, come bursting into the house because they assume that there's a fire, and they start throwing water all over the place. And that's when Encolpius and his friends manage to sort of make a subtle escape, because they can't be bothered with the rest of the night. But yeah, there was just fires constantly, and obviously there was a lot of paranoia on the part of the firemen, which is parodied in Petronius. So yeah.
And right, so while his chattels were being loaded onto one small wagon, my friend stood by the damp arches of the old Capuan gate, where King Numa had nightly meetings with his mistress. But these days, Egeria's grove and shrine and sacred spring are rented out to Jews, their gear a Sabbath haybox. So you sort of see this, but cause it's interesting because he mentions Numa because Mike from Imperium Press has talked about the importance of Numa because he was the king who brought in a lot of Rome's ancient sort of spiritual practices. So
Yeah,
So you've got the decline from Numa down to you've literally got foreign Jews coming in and using it for their own purposes. So
no, that's a really good point, Hitman. Actually, I hadn't considered that because Numa is I mean, there's this idea that sort of each of the Roman kings brought something. You have Tullus Hostilius, who was set up a lot of the military traditions, and then Numa, I mean, you have the famous shield that supposedly fell from heaven, and I think the Sibylline books were brought to Numa as well. But it is a startling inversion that something that would be honoring Numa is not only has it been passed over to any old barbarian group, but it's the Jews who, to the Romans were the most alien and hateful group in terms of their religion. The Romans just couldn't wrap their head around the idea. They say that the Jews, hated the world. So yeah, I do think that that's a very poignant or striking passage.
Okay. Each tree is under orders to pay rent to the city. The muses have been evicted, the woods turned mendicant. From here, we strolled down to Egeria's Valley, its grotto, modernised past recognition. What a gain in sanctity. An atmosphere, if green grass banks surrounded the pool, if no flash marble fronted our native limestone. Here, Ambrosius stood. There's no room in the city, he said, for the decent professions. Their emoluments are nil. My resources have shrunk since yesterday, and tomorrow will eat away more of what's left. So I'm going where day does put off his weary wings, while as yet I'm in vigorous middle age, while active years are left me. While my white hairs are still few, and I need no stick to guide my tottering feet. So farewell, Rome, I leave you. To sanitary engineers and municipal architects, fellows who by swearing black is white find it easy to land contracts for a new temple, swamp drainage, harbour works, river clearance, undertake. Yep.
No, I keep going, please.
I will say, while he's talking about engineers and architects, and he's talking about all these projects, it again reminds me of the modern world where they just they've got to build a bulldoze over everything, haven't they?
Yeah, and he also says, this point about calling white black. I mean, I think
Yeah.
that's something that you see today as well with a lot of architects and generally people who are involved in arts or architecture generally, is that they have to toe the party line with a lot of nonsense essentially in order to get a position or to get a sinecure. So yeah, I think there is that, and then there's also this idea that this is something that you won't see again until the modern era. It's a very modern thing, this idea of complaining about natural beauty being destroyed, right? And being replaced by these artificial constructions. Of course, I think that the kind of constructions that the Romans would have been building were far more elegant, more tolerable, perhaps, than what we concrete over today. I mean, it couldn't have been that bad. I don't think they knew how good they had it, but.
But remember what we said about Rome's population being 1 million. It's this idea of this ever increasing growth, and we've got to keep expanding and growing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there were also quite practical concerns. I mean, firstly, it would have been very unpleasant to live in the city permanently. I mean, it would have stank to high heaven firstly, but I mean, also especially in the summer months, because Rome used to flood very badly. I mean, God, until Mussolini came along, it still did. And a lot of the land was quite marshy, and it was really, really bad for your health. A lot of people would get sick in the summer months. So the rich Romans would retire to a villa or somewhere outside and only come into the city on business. I mean, that was the standard way that things were done. I mean, it's kind of again similar today where maybe not disease, but if you don't want to get stabbed, and you'll get a house in one of the nice outer parts of London, and you'll commute in for work to the city, and then you'll bugger off again at night. So yeah, there's a lot of parallels you can draw. There really are.
Yes, and so river clearance, undertaking the lot, then pocket the profit, and fraudulently file their petition in bankruptcy. These creatures used to be horn players, stamping the provinces. In roadshows, their puffed out cheeks, a familiar sight, but now they stage gladiatorial games, and at the mob's thumbs down, will butcher a loser for popularity's sake, and then move on to lease public privies. But why draw the line at that? These are such men as fortune, by way of a joke, will sometimes raise from the gutter and make top people. What can I do in Rome? I'm a hopeless liar. Supposing a book is bad, I can't puff it and beg for a copy. Astral motions I never learnt. Guaranteeing a father's death, that I cannot and will not do. I've never meddled with frogs' guts. Others know more about bearing adulterers' letters and presents to wives. I won't be an accomplice in larceny. Ergo, no governor will take me on his staff. I like that stab at the governors, applying they're all corrupt.
I mean, again, that's a classic trope. I mean, even by the time of when Juvenal's writing, which isn't that late. I mean, for centuries at this point, many governors viewed their proconsular power as essentially just an opportunity to get rich, and they would just absolutely fleece the provinces. I mean, that was one of the ways that I think Caesar first gained some clients, is he prosecuted someone for I can't remember the Latin term, but essentially, avarice or governmental corruption. And he did this on behalf of some Spaniards in this province who were just getting absolutely crushed. And of course, it's a quid pro quo. Someone would undertake the defense for these men or people. I mean, that's another thing that a lot of historians today struggle with. It's not, you're not doing this for individuals. It would be a group or a tribe or a people who would have representatives, and the idea is then once you've defended them, they will then have your back, be it in a street fight or in an election, they'll vote for you. It's all about this quid pro quo with patrons and clients.
Mm. Yes, certainly that is a theme that does come up in a lot of satire, and especially when we get to Marshall as well. So, yeah, it's like being a paralysed cripple, right hand useless, who today gets taken up if he's not in the know, mind seething with private matters never to be revealed. Harm the secrets bear no obligations, nor will the person who imparts them to you do you any favours thereafter. But if Verres promotes a man, that man has the screws on Verres and can trash him at will. Not all the gold washed seaward with the silt of shady Tagus is worth the price you must pay to be racked by insomnia, feared by your high-placed friends, and for what? To transient prizes unwillingly resigned. Now let me turn to that race which goes down so sweetly with our millionaires, but remains my special pet aversion, and not mince my words, I cannot, citizen stomach, a Greek Rome. Yet what fraction of these dregs is truly Greek? For years now, Eastern Orontes has discharged into the Tiber, its lingo and manners, its flutes, its outlandish harps, with their transverse strings, its native tambourines, and the halls pimped out round the racecourse. That's where you go if you fancy. Yeah.
No, this is another point which is fascinating. And again, it's very hard because you have these freedmen and they become gradually more Romanized, but it's even more complicated here to sort of establish I guess, the racial origins or ethnic origins of a lot of these people who the Roman satirists are complaining about. I mean, in Trimalchio's dinner, there's another scene where I think Encolpius is talking about some a Greek of some kind. That's the wording. A Greek of some description. And of course, all of the East was Hellenized, right? And I mentioned you had Menippus of Gadara, who was one of these early cynics. I mean, he has a Greek name, but he came from Gadara, which is in Jordan. So for all we know, he could have been a Phoenician. He could have been of Syrian extraction. Certainly later on, you have Lucian, who is a famous satirist himself, and he is of Syrian extraction. And so, but he writes in Greek. And so, yeah, there's this idea of Asians, right, or Middle Easterners or Near Easterners are often sort of just equated with Greeks. And to a Roman, they're all just the same. They're just these grasping freedmen. So yeah, it can be quite hard to distinguish, and I think that's what Juvenal is exactly picking up on and joking about here.
Yes, and another parallel. It's interesting that you've got this in Rome. You've got this very educated kind of ethnic group sort of coming in and taking up all the work, and especially from the sounds of it, doing a lot of intellectual stuff and being patroned by the ruling class. That's very
Oh
prominent
yeah,
in
I mean
today.
everybody wanted their Greek teacher, right, or their Greek rhetorician, and that in and of itself is something that again, to link this back to Petronius, Petronius or the opening fragment, or what's commonly arranged as the opening fragment and what's left of the Satyricon is this witty sort of takedown of the rhetorical schools because um and again, this shows that Petronius wasn't just this debauched guy. He was an arbiter of elegance, right? And that's not just referring to luxury; it's referring to oratory, writing, his style. He was very elegant, and he was obviously very well educated. And the idea is that you have these rhetoricians who had gained an inordinate amount of importance in the late Republic. If you think of Caesar and Cicero studying under Apollonius, I think of Rhodes, who was a famous rhetorician, and going to Athens to study rhetoric. And then you think of Cicero, which is the absolute peak of how ornamental this rhetoric could be. And of course, this is only useful in a republic, a free society where there are debates in the Senate, where it can have real power. But once you come into the imperial period, none of this stuff has any use anymore, because you're not making any of the decisions. Really, all the debates in the Senate aren't really debates. It's more of a question of how much you can compliment the emperor. And so this stuff starts to get looked down on. And the people who teach it, who are very often Greeks or Hellenized Easterners, they're looked on as just chatterers. And this is a stereotype of the Greeks that begins to appear in the Principate, of just being wafflers, who waffle on about nonsense and will debate about silly things. Some of their techniques. I mean, one rhetorical training method that they would use is they would get one of their students to defend an indefensible position. You would write a speech explaining why if your father has fallen over in the street, you won't help him up. Something like that, to train your rhetorical skill. But to men like Petronius and Juvenal later on in the Principate, this just seemed utterly absurd. It seemed like useless information, and the men who taught it just seemed like crooks.
No, absolutely. And a point I want to make is because I studied a lot of the satire when I was doing my degree, and I just want to bring up something that came up in the textbook because I think it's quite interesting. But the commentary on this satire, Satire 3, is that the sort of the university's take on it was that Juvenal being this elite, the argument was is that the elite at that time were sort of pro a lot of the stuff that that Ambrosius, shall we say, is criticising, and that rather Juvenal wrote this to make fun of the Roman freedmen, saying, "Oh, look at this bigoted sort of racist, how saying all these nasty things about Jews and Greeks, and you're, and so in a way." You could say Juvenal's a bit like a modern Guardian journalist, and Ambrosius is a bit like Moorcock's Review. Well, that's my read of it anyway.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting idea. I mean, I need to examine it because I don't know Juvenal as well as I should, not by any means. But I mean, I suppose it's not impossible that it could be a sort of, yeah, a satire of these of these sort of these older bigoted, out of fashion views, and Juvenal's actually quite cosmopolitan. But personally, I mean, to me, I don't know if that holds water, judging from the other things that I've read and the attitude of well-born men towards these newcomers.
Well,
I,
no,
mean, I don't know if there were many
Mhm.
many big fans of the Jews in the Roman aristocracy.
Yeah. Yes, that's a fair point, but it's just this idea again of you've got this decayed society with this out of touch elites and just sort of attacking the everyman. You know what I mean? That's very present in our modern times, isn't it?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that is an interesting angle. It is. I mean, God, we see enough of that, don't we?
Yeah, yeah, that's what I thought I'd mention it. So let's read a bit more. Okay. That's it. If you fancy a foreign pickup in one of those saucy tokes, while every rustic today wears dinner pumps, Trek-headed Pipner, and Niceteria medals round his cerematic or mud-caked neck, they flock in from high Sicyon or Macedonia's uplands, from Andros or Samos, from Tralles and Alabanda, all of them lighting out for the city's classiest districts and burrowing into great houses with plans to take them over. Quick wit, unlimited nerve, a gift of the gab that outsmarts a professional public speaker. That's them. So what do you take that fellow to be? He's brought every profession with him: schoolmaster, rhetorician, surveyor, artist, masseur, diviner, tightrope walker, magician, or quack. Your hungry Greekling is by all turns. Tell him to fly. He's airborne. I just like the use of the word quack. It conjures Thomas Carlyle to my mind.
Yeah, quackery. Yeah. I would note as well that you see there how he translates Greekling.
Yes.
And again, talking about this idea of no one's really sure who is a real Greek. This was actually a slang word that you see in the literature of the time, Greculi, which is just like the diminutive, these little Greeks or these Greeklings, as it's translated, as this idea of we don't really know what they are. But I think again that point there about having these note his wording. He says we have these speakers who are getting into great houses with plans to take them over, and they are outfoxing men who are trained in political speaking. And again, I think that you can relate that back to Petronius's points about rhetoric, this idea that because at this time, even at this stage of the Principate, young Roman aristocrats, actual highborn Romans, were still being taught the classical declamatio and all of these very flowery Ciceronian styles, which were pretty much useless. And it's these crafty, flattering freedmen or Greeks or Easterners who they might not have this high blown style. A lot of them, most of them weren't rhetorical teachers, but they're crafty. They know how to insinuate their way, and they know how to flatter. And they also don't. They have no qualms about flattering. and so they will, because they are more willing and able to operate in this very degraded system, and perhaps that's because the Hellenistic East had been degraded for a long time. They begin to outfox the native Romans who are still being trained for a system that doesn't exist anymore.
No, absolutely. Sort of come in and you sort of, you know, you outwit the natives and you sort of take over through subversion, essentially.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's very unfashionable to talk about this stuff in classical scholarship today, but it is there, and don't let anyone tell you that it's not.
No, certainly not. We need to get to the truth of the matter. So, next, okay. The inventor of wings for men was no more, or Slav, remember, or Thracian, but born in the very heart of Athens. Time to get out when such men put on the purple. When that's blown into Rome along with the figs and the damsons, precede me at dinner parties, or for who the witnessing of manumissions and wills, me, who drew my first breath among these Roman hills, and was nourished on Sabine olives. What's more, as none can match their talent for flattery, dummies they laud as eloquent, the ugly they call handsome, a scrag-necked weakling they liken to Hercules, hoisting the giant Antaeus aloft, way off the earth. They go into ecstasies over some shrill and scandal tenor, who cockadoodles worse than a rooster treading his hen. We can make the same compliments, but they're the ones who people believe, who can beat them in any performance of female parts, as courtesan, matron, or slave girl, no mantle either. Who swear that what you saw and heard was a woman, not an impersonator, no bulge beneath the belly, all smooth with even a suggestion of the great divide. It's a bit of facetious there.
Again, it's interesting your point of sort of parodying, the true Roman, because he has this idea of he's eating, was it Sabine, sorry,
Sabine olives.
yes, Sabian olives, and of course the Sabines were one of Rome's earliest enemies, who lived in the mountains, in sort of the central ridge that goes down the Italian peninsula. And so yeah, I think that's sort of mocking the sort of rusticity of these people in a sense. So yeah, I think it's quite a nuanced work from what I'm hearing.
And also the fact he said, I'm breathing the fresh Roman air, because you know what they say, well, it's that fine English or fine British air. Yeah, just something I noticed as well.
Yeah.
Right. Sorry, where was I? Okay. Yeah, back home, even the most famous of these tragedy queens and dames will pass unnoticed. They're a nation of actors, laugh and they'll outguffaw you, split their sides when faced with a friend's tears they weep too, though totally unmoved if you ask for a fire in winter. The Greeks don his cloaks. If you say, I'm hot, he'll begin sweating. So we're not on an unequal footing. He has the great advantage of being able, night or day, to borrow his expression from another man's face, to raise his hands in applause. When a friend burps loudly or pisses right on the mark, when the splendid drumming sound from the upturned golden basin, besides nothing sacred to him and his randy urges.
but I do think again that there is something very profound going on here, which is that these are not people from a republican culture. These are not people from a culture with a strong sort of sense of civic individualism. These are people from very autocratic, Eastern kingdoms, and so they're used to just this shameless flattery and this prostration. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because something else I want to say is because he makes that reference to they all come from Athens, but the thing is, Athens, Athenian democracy was dead for centuries at this point. It's like you're right; it's all these Eastern despotisms, and it just goes to show how Arnold Toynbee has this expression in his study of history when talking about Greek culture, where he says it's not really Hellenicism, it's Atticicism. It's the domination culture of Athens and Attica.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's very eccentric in how it's perceived. Shall we keep going, or shall we move on to Marshall?
It's up to you. It's up to you. I think maybe read a little bit more.
Okay. Right. Okay. Neither the housewife, nor her virgin daughter, nor her daughter's still beardless fiancé, nor her hitherto virtuous son, and if none of these is to hand, he'll lay his friend's grandmother. They want to worm out secrets, get a hold over people. And while we're discussing Greeks, let us consider not the gymnasium crowd, but some bigwig philosophers, like that elderly Stoic informer who destroyed his friend and pupil. He was brought up in Tarsus by the banks of the river, where his Bellerophon fell to earth from the Gorgon's flying nag. No room for honest Romans when Rome's ruled by a hunter, a Greek-born secret agents, men who, like all their race, never share friends or patrons, but keep them to themselves. One small dose of venom, half Greek, half personal, dropped in that receptive ear, and I'm out. Show the back door. My years of obsequiousness, service, all gone for nothing. Where can a hanger-on be ditched with less fuss than here in Rome? Besides, not to flatter ourselves, what use are our humble efforts? Dressing up while it's dark, still hurrying along, when the praetor's kicking his litter racing ahead to greet two maiden ladies who's been up and about for hours.
Oh.
Any comment on that? Or
Oh, sorry, I thought I lost you there for a second. I mean, it's interesting. Is he saying there that his own efforts have been dashed, or his hopes have been dashed by these Greeks?
Yeah, sounds like it. Yeah, there's I get the image of like Grima Wormtongue, whispering to Phaeton's ear.
But I think there is something in that, right? Because again, he's criticizing all of these flatterers who are trying to insinuate their way into these houses, but he's trying to do the exact same thing.
Yes.
And he's almost just bitter because he's not successful like these Greeks are. So again, how do you take that point? And I think if you consider that, then the argument of the
British being a more racist bigot. Well, I wouldn't say that. I would say the righteous Roman citizen complaining about a legitimate problem as his society is subverted and destroyed.
Yeah, I mean, I have the right to flatter and insinuate into houses. I should be the only one allowed to flatter and insinuate.
Right. Okay, there we go. So, and scared stiff lest his colleague managed to get there first. Here, a citizen's son is shouldered off the sidewalk by some rich man's slave who will hand out a legionary's tribune paid to his aristocratic amateur call girl for jerking off quickly and when some common or garden garage scrubber attracts you. You differ and hesitate. Can I afford to accost her? It's the same with court witnesses. Morals don't count if Numa or Scipio took the stand, and he escorted the mother goddess to Rome, or Metellus, who rescued Minerva's image from her blazing shrine. The immediate question who would still be, how much is he worth? And again, you've got this appeal to people like Numa and Scipio, Romans of valor and honor, and the decline since then.
Yeah, and no, it's nothing but money. And I do think that's something that comes through in the sources, and it is sad to see, and it makes you question a lot of things, because especially a lot of the guys on the right, because I've talked about this with some people, and talked about it with AM, and we've had some interesting conversations, and Marcus, this idea that a lot of people celebrate the rise of Caesar and the rise of Augustus as sort of this great saving of Rome. And I mean, in a sense, it was, some fantastic building projects occurred, and the state itself was more powerful than it ever was. But in the sense of the morals of Rome that had made Rome so strong and so invincible, this is really when they start to properly die. Even despite Augustus's attempts. I mean, another thing that people celebrate is Augustus bringing in the Lex Scantilla, the Lex Julia, trying to stamp out immorality and improve the birth rate. But I mean, what they don't want to talk about is none of these things worked. So it really is. It can be quite blackpilling when you sit and think about it like that, and it's almost as if once those ancient virtues are gone, they're gone. So yeah.
Yes, because I know you've talked about a book you have read, and I think you wrote an essay or did your dissertation on it. But it's was it The Roman Revolution by
it's
Symes?
Symes. Yeah. That is a fantastic book. Yeah, I mean, I would recommend to understand the late Republic and what happened there. I would read that, and I would read Geltzer's Caesar, Politician and Statesman. Those are both fantastic books, and of course, very controversial, which assures their quality.
I need to give that a read. But I've recently, if you've been paying attention, Columba, to my other content on the channel, I recently did some discussions with Marcus about the work of the military theorist J.F.C. Fuller. He's got some very interesting work, and one of his sort of interests is studying a generalship of different figures, and he's got a book which I've got on my shelf which I haven't read yet, called Julius Caesar, Man, Soldier, and Tyrant, which is going to be looking quite interesting to read because Fuller's actually quite critical of Caesar, so that might be an interesting read. And I need to get around to Simon. Maybe that could be a future discussion.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. Yeah, definitely. So shall we read some Marshall then?
Yes, saving the best to last, as I said before. So, right. So with Marshall, we've already talked about. So he was, unlike Juvenal or Petronius, he wasn't actually from Rome or even Italian. He was from Spain, and it's believed he may have had some Celtic origin. So to sort of set a time up, so when Petronius was around in the time of Nero, if it was certainly near Petronius Arbiter, but Juvenal is a bit later. You're looking at sort of Domitian about the Flavian period. Marshall, you're about the same time. Then Marshall was a bit later. So Marshall is known for so he comes to Rome as a young man, and he often associated himself with lots of different key figures. Like he knew Juvenal, and I think some of his
I think Marshall was younger than Juvenal though, or older rather.
Well, they're around at the same time. But yeah, I'm not certain of the exact ages, but I just know they're around at the same time because Marshall does address Juvenal in some of his epigrams, and he did actually know Juvenal. He also was because of his status as like a provincial coming into Rome. As I said, Marshall didn't have the quite same status in Rome as some of his other peers, and he often had to rely on the patron-client relationship to live. And one of his most illustrious patrons, as someone I mentioned earlier in the stream, it's Pliny the Younger, and Marshall would actually address Pliny or dedicate some of his epigrams to Pliny. And if it's all right, Columba, I actually have a letter here by Pliny, which he wrote when he heard of Marshall's death.
Oh yeah, it's a famous letter. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just going to bring it up one moment.
Yeah, I was just double checking, and Marshall's first book that he published was De Spectaculis Liber, which is a book on the spectacles. Yeah, and that was published, they reckon, in 80 A.D. to celebrate the opening of the Colosseum by the Flavians. So yeah, I would say he was slightly earlier than Juvenal, but yeah, certainly contemporaries. But anyway.
And okay. So just to read this letter. So to Cornelius Priscus, I'm distressed to hear that Valerius Marshall is dead. He was a man of great gifts and with a mind both subtle and penetrating, and his writings are remarkable for their combination of sincerity with pungency and wit. I have made him a present of his travelling expenses when he retired from Rome, and in recognition of our friendship and the verses he wrote about me, it was the custom in the past to reward poets who had sung the praises of cities or individuals with gifts of office or money, but in our day, this was one of the first things to fall out of fashion along with many other fine and honourable practices. For now that we do nothing to merit a poet's tribute, it seems foolish to receive one. You will want to know the verses which won my gratitude, and I would give you the reference had I not some of them by heart. If you like these, you can look them up the others in his published works. The poet is addressing the Muse, telling her to seek my house on the Esquiline and approach it with respect. Muse, do not knock at this learned door drunk, and at time ill chosen. All the hours of his working day he devotes to crabbed Minerva, while he prepares for the 100 Court, the speeches which after ages judged to be worthy of taking place by those of the son of Arpinum. Wait till the lamps burn late and low, when Bacchus is ruling the revels, save for the night when the brow is crowned with the rose and the hair drips perfume. This is your hour, when the Puritan's frown can relax with a smile for my verses. Was I right then to part on such friendly terms from the author of these verses about me? Am I right to mourn his death now as one of my dearest friends? He gave me of his best, and would have been given more had he been able, though surely nothing more can be given to man than a tribute, which will bring him fame and immortality. You may object that his verses will not be immortal, perhaps not, but he wrote them with that intention.
Yeah, no, I love the ending there, because I mean, think about how many works have been lost from the ancient world. I mean, someone like Quintilian or Varro. I mean, Varro was considered the most learned of the Romans. That's what Quintilian himself called him. And all we have is one one work left of Varro's on farming and nothing else, and he wrote prolifically. But yeah, what do we have? All of Marshall's epigrams,
Yes.
which I think tells you something about what people have enjoyed over the centuries.
Certainly. What I like is it's sort of implying that Pliny, he's so wise, he's all busy at court all day, don't disturb him. But when it's late after dark, then he'll enjoy your company.
Yeah. And then he brings out his scroll of Marshall and starts chuckling as well. But yeah. So do you have any epigrams that you want to read out? Because I mean, he goes all the way from the opening of the Colosseum through the reign of Domitian. And I think he maybe wrote a couple of things after that as well. But is there anything that you want to start with?
Well, just going back to him in general, Pliny mentioned that Marshall did eventually retire from Rome and go back to Spain and spent the last few years of his life there.
Yeah.
Because I think the reason for this is with Marshall, he was mostly associated with Domitian, because there are a few of his epigrams where he addresses Domitian, and they're quite fawning, like all wise, glorious Caesar, and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
And as we know, if you read the sources, Domitian is really heavily quite demonized by the sources, because I think the Praetorian Guard murder him, and he's replaced by it's Nerva, the first of the five good emperors, and then a lot of the sources are very fawning towards the five good emperors, especially sort of Nerva and later Trajan. And so
I mean, it's essentially the sort of the recovery of power or influence by the senatorial class. I mean, Nerva was a senator, an old senator, and they just threw him into office. And after that, it's not. I mean, the five good emperors. It's not. This sort of direct succession. It's done through nomination. And so there's this idea of the Senate coming back in power, and so then. Many writers who are associated with senatorials, of course, make it their business to really go after the reputation of these the emperors who have come before. I mean, that's not to say that Domitian was a saint. Far from it. I don't think many Roman emperors were, but you have to consider there's this power politics going on in the background, and of course, it would have been a pretty sketchy situation for someone like Marshall, who had really brown nosed with Domitian.
Yes, and combined with the fact I said that he wasn't this old sort of aristocracy, he was this provincial kind of, even though he tries to ingratiate himself with the new order, they never quite sort of trust him again, and he sort of, I think, is neglected a little bit, and I think that's why he goes back to Spain in the last years of his life, because he's like, sod this place, I'm going home, basically.
Yeah. I mean, I think he also had a sort of he spent years and years, decades in the city, turning day into night. And I do think that there was also probably a desire for, retirement, for rest. I mean, it is a theme that comes through in some of his epigrams, the sort of the desire for the rustic, that bucolic life. He wants to sort of throw himself into one of Virgil's Georgics or something like that. So yeah, I think it was probably a mix of those things.
Right, and his epigrams, there's about 16 books of them, and they cover basically everything: the patron-client relationship, urban life, because of his status. He lived in the area of Rome, I think that's called the Suburbia, which is sort of like the
Suburra,
Suburra, that's it. Sorry,
that's a rough neighborhood.
Yes. Lots of comments on sort of prostitutes and other ne'er-do-wells around that area. Okay, so I'm going to read several, and we can sort of discuss them afterwards. So, here we go. You never invite anybody, Cotter, unless you have bathed with him. Only the baths give you a guest. I used to wonder why you had never asked me to dinner. Now I know you didn't like me in the nude. Ready?
No, I mean that's something that comes across is he portrays himself as just being utterly shameless and constantly being focused on getting invitations to dinner parties. Yes. But I do think that he's also satirizing here, right? I mean, this stream's about satire, and he's really. That's the interesting thing about Marshall is I think whereas someone like Juvenal has these other characters, and perhaps it was because Juvenal was so high-born, relatively speaking, but someone like Marshall doesn't care. Right, and so he will use himself to make fun of these tendencies. He doesn't take himself very seriously, And I think that's part of his charm as well.
Yes, and also with the persona, Juvenal's kind of hiding behind a mask of sorts, while Marshall's just
Yeah,
out in
yeah,
the open.
definitely.
He's this very sort of brusque provincial, and maybe that could be why again he wasn't particularly well liked, shall we say?
The virgin Juvenal, the Chad
And
Marshall.
Marshall, yes. Someone needs to make a meme of that. But anywho, um, the doll at bay represents me with 100 farthings. What is such poverty doing amid luxury? Give me back the murky baths of lupus and grillus. When my dinner's this bad, why should my bath be this good? Again, early when we were talking, we mentioned Bayes, this relatively sort of upper, sort of prosperous town. So again, he's associating here with luxury, and he's sort of saying, I feel out of place here a little bit.
Yeah,
A
yeah.
bit rich for me.
He's out of his depth. Yeah.
Okay. Do you see Rufus? Celeste's brow is clouded. He walks around, treading the portico late in the day. His glum face leaves some sorrow unvoiced. His ugly nose almost touches the ground. His right hand thumps his right hand thumps his breast and tears his hair. He is not mourning a friend's death or a brother's. Both his children live. I pray they so continue. His wife is in good shape, as are his chattels and slaves. His tenant and his bailiff have not defaulted. So what is the course of his grief? He's dining at home.
Yeah, and I mean, that's something that comes to like people are just so vapid. You know
Yes.
what I mean? It's this idea that these people have absolutely everything, but they're still not happy because they didn't get invited to, I don't know, Gellis's dinner party or something.
Yes.
I mean, it is it gives you such fascinating insights. I mean, Marshall's actually one of the he's also one of the most important sources for Roman swear words. Because there's an inexhaustible supply.
Right. Whatever is served, you sweep it up from the side, and that teats of sow's udder, rib of pork, a woodcock meant for two, half a mullet and a whole pike, side of lamprey, leg of fowl, pigeon dripping with its gravy. When these had been secreted in a greasy cloth, they are handed to your boy to be taken home. As for us, we just recline, an idle throng. If you have any sense of decency, put back the dinner. I do not invite you for tomorrow, Sicilianus. So it's clearly got some sort of dinner party, and this this sort of guest sort of imposes on him too much and tries to run away with the leftovers.
Yeah, I mean that was a custom. I mean there was a word. I think they used the Greek word. I think they called them apophoreta. I might not be getting the pronunciation correct, but it's essentially what we would call a doggy bag. You know, you leave a party and they'll give you a little something or other. But yeah, he's obviously people took liberties. I mean, some of Marshall's poems were actually written specifically as a poveretta. He has a book where the whole point is that they were just maybe in the same way today that you would buy a greeting card or a birthday card and it would have a little message inside, or a little funny message. It was the exact same idea. Marshall would sell these as a set of tags, and people would attach them to gifts. I mean, there's even a section in Trimalchio's dinner where Trimalchio is handing out these gifts and they have little funny tags. So yeah, you can see all these sort of things linking together, this very frivolous dinner party culture. And yeah, you can really learn a lot about just like the tempo of Roman life from a lot of this stuff as well.
Okay. Zoilus, you spoil the bathtub washing your ass. To make it filthier, Zoilus, stick your head in it. I will say the Zoilus does come up in a lot of the epigrams.
Zoilus gets it bad. Zoilus gets it bad, yeah.
Oh, I noticed that Radlib is watching.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, everybody watching, you should sub to Radlib. Does some great work.
You should. Well versed on Roman history himself, at least from his excellent speech.
Right, okay. An innkeeper, a butcher, a bath, a barber, a board and pieces, and a few little books, but I must choose them. One friend not too new, a large boy, smooth-cheeked for a long time to come, and a girl of whom my boy is fond. Give me these, Rufus, even at Butanti, and keep Nero's baths.
Yeah, I mean this is, you're starting to get this theme where he says this constantly, and it's really funny because it's something that you see even in his early books. You know, he sort of says that he'd love to lead this rustic life, but I mean, he doesn't leave the city until he's an old man.
Yes.
I think he really he says these things, but really he can't seem to tear himself away.
Yes, it's like I don't need your baths. Just give me my own bath, but I want all these luxuries with
Yeah.
it.
I mean, there's a great line as well where he say what is it? He says like, "Give me a plump wife that's not too well read." Which I think it's great. He's like, give me a plump wife. I don't want to talk to her about any intellectual things. Yeah, it's great.
You don't like anyone to wash in the bathtub before yourself, Coitulus. What is the reason except that you would rather not be laved by irrimated water? But though you are thirst in the bath, it needs must be that your cock is washed here before your head.
I would say I love the translation there. Irrimated water. Of course, anyone who's familiar with Catullus's famous Catullus 16, pedicabo ego vos et irumabo. Irumabo is how should I put it? To be quite forceful in an intimate manner.
Oh boy.
Well, how about I take a turn and I'll read some of it.
Sure. Yeah. Go for
Okay,
it.
so here's one. Diaolus was once a surgeon. Now he's an undertaker. He started to practice medicine the only way he knew how. So it's this idea that he's finally being honest, because I mean, doctors back then were more liable to kill you than
Yes.
to heal you. Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, you had no anaesthetic or anything like that. So
No. Well, actually, that's not true. In the Middle Ages, sure, but Galen, who was widely read in the ancient world, from Alexandria, he actually has recipes for a couple of anesthetics. One of them was actually using the opium plant, and he says, be very careful not to use too much. So yeah, I mean, they did have some things, but
also, no. Unfortunately, they had a method for like stopping pregnancy as well, didn't they?
yeah. I mean, they had a couple of methods. I mean, one of them, which Radlib talked about in his speech, was silphium, which actually went extinct because they used it so much, which tells you something. But okay, so here's another one. You fancy yourself a wit, Caecilius. Believe me, you're not. What then? You're a vulgar buffoon. What you are, the cheap jack from across Tiber is, who barters yellow sulphur matches for broken glass, and the vendor of steaming peas pudding to the idle crowd, and the keep owner of reptiles, and the salt fishmonger's worthless varlets, and the bawling cook who totes smoking sausages round stuffy bistros, and the second-rate alley poet, and the shameless impresario from Gades, and the smart mouth of an aging queen. So, Caecilius, stop fancying yourself what nobody else fancies you, fit to outdo Gaba with your quips, and Tetius Cabalus himself. It is not given everyone to have a nose. He who jests with blockish impudence is no Tetius, he's a Cabalus. And so again, it's this idea of just really, I mean, this is something that Marshall notices a lot. He's very critical of people who are too big for their boots. And yeah, people who fancy themselves to be these well-read men, but really they're just I guess what someone online would call a sood. A sood today is the term that I see. And he also says an aging queen, and of course
Yes.
he's not talking about an actual queen. He's talking about like an old gay basically who's long in the tooth, a dandy or something like that.
It's also interesting because he says that you come here from across the Tiber, so because obviously, I'm assuming he means the other side of town, basically. Someone, he also talked about how this Coisus likes to barter, so it seems to imply you come from the rough end of town here and try and clean yourself up.
Here's another one. Quid faciat se sciri liri negat ebria semper, quid faciat vult sciri liris, quod sobria felat. Which translated means Lyris is always saying that she doesn't know what she is doing when she is drunk. Lyris wants to know what she does, the same as when she's sober. She sucks. It's very ribald, shall we say?
Yes.
Yeah. What's another one here? You're surprised that Marius's ear smells disagreeably. That is your doing. You're the one chattering in his ear, Nestor. So it's basically saying that he has bad breath, which is another one
Yeah.
you can see a lot. I prefer a freeborn girl, but if none is available, my second choice is a freed woman. A slave girl is last in line, but if she is better to look at than either, so far as I am concerned, she's born free. That's the Marshall was the ancient time stealer. You see,
Yes.
he's getting his Asian QT.
I don't know. I'm also getting some shades of a thirsty Benito, as Aya likes to say about Marcus. I say that in jest. Marcus is wonderful.
Oh, listen, he has no choice in the matter. People speak about it like he has a choice. It's in his blood.
Yes. You can. What do they say? You can take the med out of Italy, but you can't take the Italy out of the med.
Sorry. If you have any more to go, then sorry, I'm just browsing right now.
Oh no, say some more. Actually, I'll read one quickly while you're looking.
Sure.
Okay. Right. Okay. Faustinus, if you want to cool a bath so hot that Julianus would have trouble getting into it, ask the claimer Sabinius to wash in it. He chills the warm baths of Nero. I think just mocking someone, probably got quite a cold personality, not very likable.
Yeah. There's a chilly, frigid person. Some of them were actually, he didn't just write very short little epigrams. Some of them were a bit longer, and I think this one is really funny because it's even worse than Trimalchio. It's like Trimalchio times 1,000. It's absurd, and it always sticks in my mind. It's book 3, 82, and so it goes like this. Whoever can stand dinner with Zoilus, again, Zoilus just getting shat on. Whoever can stand dinner with Zoilus, let him dine among Sumemius's wives and drink sober from Leda's broken jar. That would be easier and cleaner. I'll be bound. Clothed in green, he lies, filling up the couch, and thrusts his guests on either hand with his elbows, propped up on purples and silk cushions. A youth stands by, supplying red feathers and slips of mastic as he belches, while a concubine, lying on her back, makes a gentle breeze with a green fan to relieve his heat, and a boy keeps off the flies with a sprig of myrtle. A masseuse runs over his frame nimbly and skillfully, scattering an expert hand over all his limbs. The eunuch knows the signal of his snapping finger and probes the coy urine, guiding his tipsy penis as his master drinks.
Oh dear.
But himself, bending back towards the crowd at his feet, in the midst of lapdogs who are gnawing on goose livers, divides a boar's sweetmeats among his wrestling coaches and bestows turtle rumps on his fancy boy, while we are served with the produce of Liguria's rocks, or must cooked in Massiliot smoke. He pledges his naturals in Opimian nectar with crystal and murine cups. Himself dusky with Cosmos's files, he does not blush to distribute a needy drab's hair oil among us, out of a gold shell, no less. And so he's wearing Cosmos. And this is something that's interesting, you notice in Martial is you actually get an idea of businesses in ancient Rome at the time. Cosmos comes up again and again as a famous seller of makeup and perfumes. Apparently he was really popular amongst the elite, but I think it's really funny that the host himself is covering himself in fine perfume and from Cosmos, but then he's giving the guests just absolute crap. But he has the cheek to serve out of a gold murine shell, and of course, these were, I believe, the shells, the creatures that they would use to create purple dye. And so it's a very luxurious item, and he's covered it in gold. But yeah, he's just giving them terrible oil.
So on that note, that reminds me of an anecdote I once read about the author Roald Dahl. He once used to invite people over to dinner parties, and what he would do is He would have all the nice fine wine to himself. He would then take some low quality wine, pour it into the nice wine bottles, and then serve it at the dinner and get everybody to compliment on how nice it was.
But I
But
think that's something Marshall would have appreciated, though, to have
yes,
these people who don't know anything saying, "Oh, how beautiful this wine is."
yes. Okay.
Yeah, God, I mean, I'm trying to find something that's like somewhat PC here, but
Mhm. I think that's impossible with Marshall being a shitposter that he is. Hang on,
how about this? You refuse nobody, Tyus, but if you're not ashamed of that, then at least be ashamed of this, Tyus. You refuse nothing. so he's basically saying, well, you might not be ashamed about who you go with, but what you do with them.
I've got a longer one. I've got a longer one here.
Go for it.
So, do you wish to know why it is, Ligurianus, that nobody's glad to meet you, that wherever you go, there is flight and a vast solitude around you? You are too much of a poet. This is a very dangerous fault. A tigress roused by the theft of her cubs is not feared so much, nor yet a viper burnt by the midday sun, nor yet a vicious scorpion. For I ask you, who would endure such trials? You read to me as I stand, you read to me as I sit, you read to me as I run, you read to me as I shit. I flee to the baths, you boom in my ear, I head for the pool, I'm not allowed to swim. I hurry to dinner, you stop me in my tracks. I arrive at dinner, you drive me away as I eat. Tired out, I take a nap, you rouse me as I lie. Do you care to see how much damage you do? A just man, upright and innocent, you are feared. So just like, leave me alone.
Oh, I mean, some of them are also just like really violent. Here's a good one. In Latin, it's ut patiar moicum rogat uxor gale sed unum, huic ego non oculus eruo gale duo, which just means my wife asks me, Gallus, to tolerate a lover, just one. Shall I not gouge out both his eyes? But I mean, this is an interesting thing about Marshall, which is another point that I want to bring up. Of course, most of the really respectable verse is written in things like dactylic hexameter, the epic sort of meter. And Marshall, he sticks to Roman metrical rules, but there are a couple of interesting things. For example, you will occasionally see rhyme in Marshall, which is something that you don't really see at all in ancient Greek or Roman poetry is rhyme, where of course to us, be it French or German or English, rhyme is, or it was until I'd say the last century, considered essential to most poetry. But you can see that last line there, huic ego non oculus eruo gale duo. And so he has that rhyme come in, which I think is a very interesting stylistic point as well. I mean, that's the thing. In terms of his actual poetical skill, Marshall is quite good. There are some really good lines in there, but he just devotes it entirely to the most dirty stuff you can imagine.
Got time for some more? Or?
I'd say we do a couple more and then we'll call it. How about that?
Okay, sure. Okay, here's another one. To escape monogenies in the public baths and around the private baths is not possible. Try what device you will, he'll grab you at the warm trigon with right and left so that he can often score a point to you for the balls he catches. He'll collect from the dust and bring back the loose follis, even if he is already bathed and already put on his slippers. If you take your towels, he'll say they are whiter than snow, though they be dirtier than a baby's lap. As you comb your scranty hair with the split ivory, he'll say you have arranged locks of Achilles. He'll fetch you an aperitif with his own hands from the dregs of a smoky flagon, and continually wipe the moisture from your forehead. He'll praise everything, admire everything, until after enduring 1,000 annoyances you say, "Come to dinner." Again, just attacking the sort of the fawning sycophants.
Yeah, and then you can also, I mean, I remember reading an article on Marshall, which actually posed the question of, how public were these? Because I mean, in the case of Catullus, I think there have actually been some verses of Catullus found on walls as graffiti, which shows that it was sort of very well known as sort of famous lines, like we are today with English verse. There are certain lines that a lot of people will know, but there was even the idea that not only were Marshall's scrolls or books, published and then shared amongst the well-to-do. But there was also the idea that some of them might have been pasted up, in public places so that people could read them and laugh. And there's evidence of sort of how do you say, grudges between different poets. Marshall was just one of many budding sort of epigrammatists, and some of them far worse than others. And there are a couple of epigrams extant where he's sort of replying to them. So it's like one example would be versiculos in me narrator scriberi quina, non scribit cuius carmina nemo legit, which is just Cinna is reported to be writing verses against me, but nobody writes whose poems nobody reads. It's as well, he can write about me all he wants. No one reads them anyway. They're terrible. So yeah, there's a lot of sort of grudges going on, and that's why I always say it's like sort of an ancient Roman version of Twitter basically. It's endlessly entertaining.
Yeah, see, his work is absolutely wonderful and brings a laugh, doesn't it?
Always, and yeah, you can get a lot through it. You get a lot from it, rather, in terms of understanding common life and understanding vulgar Latin, shall we say? I mean, of course, it's not vulgar Latin in the strict term that people think of, like the Vulgate Bible, say, but in terms of what the dialect of the common man was like. I mean, you also get some of this from Petronius as well, because you'll notice in a lot of translations of the Satyricon, if it's in English, someone like Trimalchio, the freedman, he'll speak in a looser and less classical way than someone like Encolpius, the narrator. He'll use sort of he'll shorten his words, and he'll use a bit of slang. And you see that in the Latin as well. And that's why it's a very valuable source for philologists or what have you, because you get an insight into Roman working class dialogue, if you want to put it like that, which is something obviously you're not going to get from someone like Cicero or Caesar. So yeah, it's very entertaining, and you can learn a lot from it.
Yes, yeah, and again, you more insight into Trimalchio being a nouveau riche.
Yeah,
he still,
yeah.
he still talks like.
Yeah, he still talks like a foreigner. He's never mastered the sort of the pure Latin or the pure. I mean, you still see that today with these middle class people who will speak in this received pronunciation, this Queen's English or whatever, but they get things wrong occasionally. They'll get certain pronunciations wrong, and you notice it, and it's irritating, and yeah, it's something that you see. So again, I think especially in the case of the satirists, you can read them and really see your own time sort of reflected, because it's this chaotic time of very swift cultural change and all these new luxuries and these new strange dinner entertainments and fashions and things like that. So yeah, I think I don't know if it's very comforting reading. I don't think you're going to come away with a terrible amount of optimism, but you will laugh.
Well, yeah, we need to laugh about these things, otherwise we bang our head against the wall until we
die.
So.
in the words of Marshall himself, "Ride si sapis," laugh if you're wise. Yes. I think they're words to live by.
Absolutely. One other thing about Trimalchio, the whole fact he doesn't speak, like he's posh or sort of has a high upbringing, it can be a bit deceptive, because I notice this a lot with a lot of contemporary celebrities. I think of someone like Danny Dyer. So they sound like all right, like they sound all cockney, and it deceives you to think, oh yeah, it's just a regular bloke like us, but he's not. He's some rich celebrity, so he's not like you.
Yeah, there's the idea, but that's the thing though. That's the sort of, I'd say that's a peculiar. That's part of the strange inversion of our times, which sets it apart. Is that in Marshall's time, something like that wouldn't have been glorified, but today, to speak properly is actually looked down upon.
Mm.
So yeah, that's a sort of a notable difference, I suppose.
Yeah, I remember AA made a point like that some years ago. I remember him talking about like you've got Monty Python, and that sketch was at Posh Twitch of the Year award where they absolutely lampoon that archetype
Yeah,
ruthlessly, and now no one wants to look like that anymore because though he's not, I don't think he's very admirable. But someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg, people don't like him just because of how he talks and how he
yeah,
dresses, and
yeah.
I think he's a scumbag like the rest of them, as he's shown to be. But the people, they don't like him, but for like the wrong reason, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's nothing to do with money. I mean, there are many wealthy celebrities who these lefties will absolutely fawn over, even though these people are millionaires, maybe even billionaires.
Mm,
Yeah, they'll fawn over them. It's not about that. It's about hostility to the older or more established culture, a lack of respect, a disdain for tradition. I think that's what comes through there. I mean, the problem with someone like Mogg, of course, is that he pretends to be some 18th century gentleman, but he's just, I mean, his family works in finance, don't they? Like all of
mm,
these noblemen today.
mm,
So again, I mean, that's another parallel you could draw with the Romans, is that even
mm,
these well-born people,
mm.
by
Yes, because
just because of the times, yeah, they're forced into these low occupations, shall we say?
yeah, because it's interesting that in our cursed modern world, someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg seems like an aristocrat when 100 years ago he certainly
Yeah,
wouldn't have been.
yeah. I mean, he's sort of gentry, really, isn't he? I mean, he's not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's in the Commons at the end of the day.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, good point. Oh, he's no Robert Cecil, is he?
No, no,
No.
no. Well,
Okay.
I'm out of time, my boy.
Mm. And well, that was a wonderful conversation, Columba. Many good laughs and some wise insights, and I hope it was informative and entertaining for anybody who watches or watches this. So, thank you, everybody. Before we go, is there anything you would like to share, Columba?
Well, I have been writing this silly story over on my Substack. It's my pinned tweet. So if you go to my Twitter account, you'll see it. And it's essentially a sort of a picaresque, in the style of maybe Candide or maybe even something like Petronius. The idea is
Mm.
sort of lampooning a lot of the more ridiculous things that we see on the right
Oh
today.
yes, I love the name of that village at Chuddington on Gripe.
Yeah, it's set in the quaint village of Chuddington on Groip, and it follows young Augustus Chudwick. Yeah, it's just a bit of fun, but I was quite proud of it, and I'm writing more. I've got 4 chapters finished now, actually, so I've been on a bit of a roll.
Mm.
But yeah, apart from that, I've got nothing in the works, I'm afraid.
Oh, yeah, well, everybody go and follow Columba and read his Substack. It's absolutely wonderful. So, with respect to this channel, unfortunately, it's very unlikely there's going to be anything else for the rest of this year, as in the coming couple of weeks, I will actually be buying a house and moving. So, redecoration and moving in and all of that. I'm not saying there won't definitely not be anything, but my life's going to be a bit hectic over the next couple of weeks.
Mm,
So, there's a chance I may not be able to do anything for the rest of the year, but watch this space. However, something else I can shill is next week, next Monday, I will be going onto Apostolic Majesty's channel to
yeah,
discuss with him, Panama Hat, and possibly Marcus Furious Pertinax as well, the Estado Novo, or Portugal's national dictatorship. So Salazar, being the main figure associated with that and regime, is quite a fascinating and interesting figure. So that'd be a great
be
conversation.
fantastic. Yeah, and Panama Hat's a very learned gentleman as well. It's good to hear he'll be on. I
Mm.
think I'll tune in.
Wonderful. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening, and good night.
Night, chaps.